My name is Jonathan, and I never imagined that visiting my wife at her office would become one of the most eye-opening and unsettling experiences of my life, because it all started on a crisp Monday morning when I decided to surprise her at the corporate headquarters where she worked as a CEO, a position she had earned after years of hard work, long nights, and relentless dedication. And as I drove into the bustling downtown district, I felt a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation, imagining her reaction, the smile on her face, maybe a quick tour of her office, coffee in hand, and a brief conversation about her latest projects. But as I approached the revolving doors of the building, I noticed a new sign at the entrance, one I had never seen before, sleek, modern, and slightly ominous in its phrasing, reading, "Authorized personnel only, CEO's confidential affairs beyond this point." And at first, I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Maybe some kind of corporate humor that I didn't understand. But the more I read and stared, the more I felt an unease creeping into my chest, like the first hints of a storm on a calm day. And I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that my wife, Amanda, had always been meticulous about security, about privacy, about maintaining boundaries in her office, and maybe this was just another layer of protocol. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this was different, that there was a subtle tension in the way the sign was worded, a hidden message that something had changed, that something was being kept from me. And so I entered the building, greeted the receptionist with a polite nod, and asked if Amanda was available for a quick chat. And the young woman smiled politely but hesitated, glancing at a screen, then saying, "I'm afraid the CEO is currently unavailable for personal visits. Can I take a message?" And I felt that familiar pit in my stomach, that sense of distance forming suddenly between us, because Amanda had always welcomed me into her office before, even with her busy schedule. And now this barrier, subtle but unmistakable, made me feel like a visitor in my own marriage, a stranger walking into a fortress I thought I knew intimately. And I insisted politely but firmly, explaining that I was her husband, that I had just come by to see her for a few minutes. And after a tense pause, the receptionist nodded, gave me directions to the executive elevator, and I stepped inside, my heart beating faster, my mind racing with possibilities, both mundane and alarming. And as the elevator climbed to the top floor, I rehearsed how I would greet her, what I would say, and how I would react if she was indeed busy or if something had changed between us. Because despite our 10 years of marriage, the dynamics of power, ambition, and secrecy at her level of corporate hierarchy could create distance that was both professional and personal. And when the doors opened, I stepped into the sleek, glass-paneled floor, the sunlight bouncing off the skyscrapers, and the hushed buzz of assistants and managers filled the air, each carrying folders, tablets, and expressions of quiet urgency. And I began walking toward the corner office, expecting to hear the familiar click of Amanda's heels, the warm greeting, and instead, I was stopped by another sign, this one more official, almost bureaucratic in tone, reading, "Entry requires CEO clearance, personal visits to be scheduled in advance." And at that moment, I felt a shock ripple through me, because this was more than protocol. This was a clear signal that something had changed, that my access, both literal and emotional, was being restricted, and I wondered if it was a temporary measure, a misunderstanding, or something deeper, a shift in the balance of our marriage that I hadn't anticipated. And I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to turn back, call her, or push forward. And then a voice, calm but firm, came from behind me. "Jonathan?" And I turned to see Amanda approaching, her expression composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of surprise, a recognition of the tension in the air. And I said carefully, "Amanda, I just wanted to see you. Maybe talk for a few minutes." And she smiled, polite but distant. "Jonathan, I'm sorry, but the office has new security protocols. Personal visits aren't allowed without prior approval." And my stomach sank, because I realized that the situation was more than just corporate bureaucracy, that there was a hidden layer of secrecy I hadn't been aware of. And I asked gently, almost pleading, "Amanda, Is there something going on? Why the signs? Why the restrictions? And she hesitated, then said, "It's complicated. There are projects, legal matters, and some sensitive information that I cannot discuss in public areas." And I nodded, trying to understand, trying to respect her boundaries. But the unease grew, because this wasn't just about work. This was about access, trust, and transparency in our marriage. And I knew her too well to ignore the subtle shifts in tone. The careful choice of words, the way her hands lingered briefly on the doorframe, almost as if to create another layer of barrier between us, and I took a deep breath and said, "Amanda, I respect your work, I respect your position, but I need to know if this is just about security, or if it's about us, because the signs feel personal, and it's making me feel excluded, unwelcome, and I can't just ignore that." And she looked at me, eyes softening for a moment. And then she led me down a hallway to a private conference room, explaining that this was the only area where sensitive discussions could take place. And as we entered, she closed the door, sat across from me, and finally the truth began to emerge. Piece by piece, layer by layer, like peeling back the surface of a well-guarded mystery. Because what I discovered was not just about corporate secrecy, but about hidden challenges, unspoken threats, and decisions made at a level I had never been exposed to. And Amanda began explaining that she had been dealing with a corporate espionage case, that confidential documents had been compromised, that certain staff members had been leaking information, and that her role as CEO required her to implement unprecedented security measures, including limiting access to the office floor, even to those closest to her, to protect the company, the employees, and ultimately, our family's financial future. And as she spoke, the tension in my chest began to ease slightly, replaced by awe and respect for the magnitude of her responsibilities, but also a lingering shock at the level of secrecy, the isolation she had endured in silence. And as the conversation continued, she shared emails, legal notices, and detailed descriptions of the protocols she had been forced to implement. And I realized that the signs, the restrictions, and the cold formality were not about me personally, but about safeguarding everything she had worked for, protecting information that could have caused irreparable damage if mishandled. And yet, even with the logical explanations, my heart ached because the emotional distance, the sense of exclusion had been real, even if unintentional, and I began to understand the weight she carried, the constant tension between professional duty and personal connection. And as we talked, I saw glimpses of vulnerability behind her composed facade. The strain in her shoulders, the faint lines of exhaustion etched across her face, the way she hesitated before answering certain questions. And I realized that the CEO I admired was also human, balancing immense responsibilities, facing threats I could scarcely comprehend, and striving to maintain our marriage under extraordinary circumstances. And I listened, asked questions, expressed concern, and at the end I said, "Amanda, I understand now. I see why the signs were there, why the restrictions were in place, and I respect that. But I also need you to know that even when you're protecting the company, I want to feel included, aware, and trusted, because love doesn't operate on secrecy, even when the intent is protection." And she nodded, eyes glistening, appreciating my words, and we devised a plan, a compromise that would allow her to maintain the security protocols while keeping me informed, giving me the access I needed to feel part of her life. And at that moment, I realized that marriage, like business, requires transparency, communication, and trust. And even in the midst of corporate crises, it is possible to navigate secrecy with honesty, because what had begun as a shocking, alienating encounter had transformed into a lesson about resilience, partnership, and the delicate balance between professional duty and personal intimacy. And as I left the office that day, stepping back into the busy city streets, I felt a profound respect for Amanda, for her courage, for the burdens she carried silently, and for the realization that love, when paired with understanding and communication, can survive even the most intimidating walls, signs, and secrets, because the truth, once revealed, can restore connection, trust, and hope in ways that are far more powerful than we imagine. And that day, the sign at her office wasn't just a warning or a barrier, it became a symbol of the hidden battles we face, the unseen struggles of those we love, and the importance of patience, empathy, and courage in uncovering the secrets that matter most to our hearts and relationships. And I drove home that evening with a new appreciation, a sense of awe, and a commitment to support her, to stand beside her, and to honor the difficult choices she had made to protect not just her company, but the family we had built together, knowing that the challenges ahead would be many, but with honesty, respect, and love. Nothing, no sign, no secret, no obstacle could come between us.